And with tensions between the United States and Iran rising daily, Australia's energy security is once again in the spotlight. Being dependent on energy from a region as volatile as the Middle East could be a major problem, particularly as our petrol reserves are currently sitting below our International Energy Agency obligation, which is 90 days supply. Dr. Paul Barnes is head of the Risk and Resilience Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and he joins me now from Canberra. Dr. Barnes, we're supposed to have 90 days supply of oil stocks under these obligations. We don't have that. What do we have, and how exposed are we?
Well, Gemma, that number will vary between 23 days, 25 days to a higher number. But the broader issue is that it's not just petroleum products, it's also diesel products, and being at the end of a very long maritime supply chain, we also are dependent on crude oil imports as well.
And so why don't we have the supplies that are needed?
Well, it's been government policy for some time now not to specifically focus on controlling the stocks that are stored within the country. And there is a reliance on the market to provide just-in-time supply of refined fuels and the crude oil from overseas sources.
Is that a position that sits comfortably with someone like you who assesses risk?
Well, certainly there would, from my perspective, there's a degree of vulnerability that the country faces that it should be considering in greater detail. And in fact, the government has a refined fuel review process underway. There was an interim report earlier this year. But the broader issue we need to look at is that Australia also is working on a national energy security assessment, which was last done in 2011 and is probably quite due for an update. So we hope to have that at the end of this year. But the broader notion is, with geopolitical strife in various parts of the country, certainly the South China Sea being one location, but the Middle East currently another, and the reliance on long maritime supply chains, it would behoove any risk assessor to consider the vulnerabilities faced by that.
And what does Australia need to do to reduce our vulnerability? What can we do?
Well, there's a number of issues that has been suggested, and certainly I don't want to put words in the government's mouth, and I'm sure they're reviewing a range of options currently, and since the last few days even more thoroughly than they may have done. One of the options is to consider storing fuel in country. Now, currently that is not done. There's not a government policy position to do that. The remaining refineries that we have in this country, we could start to consider how they could be tooled up to produce, in quite short notice, refined fuels that we may need should there be problems with our supply chains coming into the country.
And how transparent has the government been when it comes to reporting these fuel stocks? I know you said that there's a completed report due, but how would you assess that transparency?
Well, the government, I must say, some of the public servants working on the review have been very thorough in my experience and my contact with them. So there's no reduction in terms of the skill that the public service has applied on behalf of the government in terms of doing the review. But the government is focusing on reliance specifically on the market to supply just-in-time stocks. Unfortunately, the market works perfectly when there's no geopolitical stresses in the world. And so the government could be more transparent specifically about how it's dealing or how it would deal with emergency issues should there be interruptions to our supply. But of course, Japan is more vulnerable to us than us. 90% of its oil comes from the Middle East. Singapore obviously gains most of its crude oil from the Middle East, and we rely on Singapore for most of our refined petroleum products. So there's a connection that we have to consider. It's a complex system, and the government possibly could be more open about how they would deal with issues if they come to a head.
Yeah, because we're in a more vulnerable position than the US, and should it be assumed that we would support the US in any boil-over of tensions there when we have a lot to lose, of course, but also we had no input or consultation in President Trump's actions there?
Well, that's true. That's slightly beyond my work as a vulnerability assessor, but of course the Americans are not in the same level of vulnerability to fuel imports than we are. The 1970s fuel crisis was a very big wake-up call for the US government at the time, and since then they've become almost self-sufficient in terms of a lot of the fuel products, or certainly the crude oil. They have their own supplies, shale oil and other on-land supplies of oil, etc. And their refining capacity is quite deep. So in terms of the impacts of any problems with maritime supply of oil coming out of the Middle East, should issues become more heated than they are, they're not necessarily going to be as vulnerable as many other economies are.
Dr. Paul Barnes, Head of the Risk and Resilience Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.